picking it up from this one. Sweet.
I can log you on.
Well, I guess you're
Try to open a browser or something like that.
Oh, that's fine. I'm just gonna try it so it doesn't matter. I'm just gonna.
So we'll wait a good time.
Oh, yeah.
Do you need to get online next? Probably not tough to do.
This is cool. That's exactly what someone
Yeah, exactly.
In fact, there was a sheets of just
Oh, really? Is that as fast as possible?
The president.
We're so sorry.
No, decade ago.
Okay, well, we usually just walk down on
No,
campus.
that's right.
So if you just do the same stuff.
This type of-
Oh, yeah, yeah. It's true. If you go a little further. Yeah, so.
My wife still uses it. And I told her Brian uses the lectures and she thought better.
There's only going to be access at the campus. So straight into flying into the church.
Does it magnify or just shows one to one?
Hey, how's that?
Huh.
East Coast.
Yeah, especially like it's March.
No, I didn't. Okay, this is my station. Thanks for asking. Oh, okay. I thought this was about the GS. Yeah, that's good. All right. Good afternoon, everybody. I just want to welcome to the CCRMA Colloquium every Wednesday at 5:15, the Center for Computer Research in Music and Acoustics. Just want to remind you about some of the upcoming colloques. Next week, John LeGroux will be here. His title of his talk is Studio of the Future. He's the founder of the POW-R Consortium, so it's got a nice technical bent to studio design. And week after that, the colloque will be on Thursday, not on Wednesday, so we won't have a colloquium on Wednesday here. But on Thursday, up in the stage, we'll have Marcus Schmickler, who is visiting faculty at Cal Arts. And Marcus is a Berliner who is a composer, electronic music composer and professor. He's taking someone's place down at Cal Arts. We've asked him to come up here to give a talk and then an ensuing concert up in the stage, so that ought to be very interesting. Today we have Marc Weidenbaum. He's the founder of Disquiet, which focuses on disquiet.com's website, which focuses on the interaction of sound, art, and technology. He's a writer and curator and currently teaches at the Academy of Art in San Francisco. Welcome to Marc.
Thanks. I teach this course and I use slides in it that I sort of pull from my catalog when I need them, but I'm going to try to do something a little more linear with this. First, thanks to CAR for the invitation. It's just pretty exciting to be here. I live in San Francisco, and CCRMA looms as a destination and a kind of inspiration on the horizon. I find myself interacting with it from a distance frequently. I just recently interviewed Chris Carlson, who's a graduate, who developed this wonderful app called Borderlands. I've also written about a lot of musicians who I find out after the fact are CCRMA attendees. I wrote about Mike Rotunda, if any of you remember him from his time here. I knew him before he attended here because I just wrote about his music. He actually wrote a beautiful piece about dedicated to the Mission District. And I liked it so much I asked him what it was about, and he said, "Oh, I'm leaving to attend Karma." So it was the last thing I guess he wrote before he moved south. I think the first time I ever came down for a meeting down here for an event was people were seated here, and it was an insane alignment of all the current and past faculty, Max Matthews, and it was just a remarkable thing. And when I would walk around, I kept thinking, "Oh, please don't be in that room. Please be in some room other than that." But here I am, nonetheless. I'm going to use this opportunity to make a transition because I've been writing this book, which is the reason I'm here, for the past year. This is the reason I'm here. It's a book in a series called 33 1/3, and it takes as its subject the record whose cover is almost entirely this. There's a little bit more. It's a record album released in 1994 by Aphex Twin, who's an accomplished electronic musician, and the album has its 20th anniversary next month. The 33 1/3 series is a collection of books, each one of which is about a different record album, and each of the different records is approached from a different perspective from the individual. I think I see a copy right there. It's alarming. And it just came out last Thursday, so this is very new to me. So this transition I'm making is having spent a full year having written the book, based on 19 previous years of experience of it, because I really want to write about a record that's a favorite of mine. But then finally, having finished it and gone through pre-press, now beginning to venture out into the world and do talks like this. This is the first I've given in public since the book came out, so I'm I'm still finding my way in how to express these ideas spoken instead of written. I did a recording of a video recently, like a promotional video. I was told it was a very good idea to write a book, do a promotional video. I discovered that what I wrote and what sounded good in my head was almost impossible to read out loud. Especially clauses separated by M dashes just don't make for good public speaking. Nonetheless, I will be reading just a tiny bit from the book, and you can sort of just nod along as that occurs. So this record came out in 1994. Aphex Twin had just recently left a Belgian label called RNS, and he released on that a collection of very early work from his teens to his early 20s called Selected Ambient Works, 85 to 92. And he switched over to Warp Records, which then was quite new and small, and simultaneously, right around that time, signed with Sire, not simultaneously, but shortly thereafter, signed with Sire in the US. And the signing with Sire in particular helped expand his range well beyond the dance music world, and that expansion of his renown is a part of the story that's going to be told today. The record is a strange object for many reasons, one of which is it's not quite clear when you say the record, what you mean. The main edition of it, released in Britain, has 25 tracks. Most editions in the US have 23, and there's versions with 24 having to do with the format that it's on, CD versus vinyl versus cassette, and having to do with the region in which it's released, Japan versus England versus the US and the rest of the world. With the exception of one track, none of them have titles, and this plus the addition of these 2 tracks makes it really difficult for 2 people when they meet in a dark corridor to explain to each other which track it is that they have great affection for. You're like, which one do you like exactly? You know, I like the one with the wind chimes. Oh, the one with the wind chimes. Is that number 5 or 6? I think it's number 2 or 3, but which edition do you have? And the confusion that resulted from these tracks not having titles became part of the vaporous experience that it had upon release. It was a very murky object. But over time, it's become codified and understood, and this is why this idea of the cultural afterlife being a form of change is the subject of what I want to talk with you about, which is how this very murky, vaporous object that occurred and appeared in '94 has become known and much more understood and appreciated, and what started as vapor has become composition over time. '94 is quite a remarkable year for music. It was the year that Kurt Cobain passed away, just a month or so after the record's release. It was the year that Pavement released Crooked Rain, Crooked Rain. It was actually the year that I previously pitched a book to the same series back in 2007, and I realized after the fact that it was from the same year as well. They rejected that proposal. That was Los Lobos has a spin-off band called the Latin Playboys, and it involved 2 of the main people from Los Lobos plus Chad Blake and Mitchell Froom. Chad Blake had been producer Mitchell Froom, sort of studio guy for a long time, and he eventually came out of that shadow and became renowned in his own right. But it was a remarkable little record, but '94 was apparently an important year to me because I didn't realize till after the fact. So the book is 35,000 words long. It's actually only half of the writing I did in the project. There's another about 45,000 that I accumulated in the course of it. So this talk is me trying to walk through some of the key points from it and focus on one of the main themes. The 2-ish main themes of the book are its misunderstanding. the conceptual and received wisdom that's arisen around the record since its release. And I try to challenge some of that just to refocus people's appreciation of it. There are certain words become shorthand for records over time, and one of those key words is the word beatless. The idea that this record had no beat. And I found that that's just simply not the case, that there's, I mean, I can sort of prove it takes 35,000 words to prove a point, but you can also just hit play on a track and the music has a pulse. It's a little quiet in here, but in any case. So this is what the spines of the releases look like. Mine's number 90 in the series, and there's a handful more coming out. The 89th was by Jonathan Lethem, writing about the Talking Heads. And around that time, the publisher was purchased by Bloomsbury, the British academic publisher. And there was a brief period of time where it was not quite clear if the series was going to continue. You'll see some favorites here. Look at Songs That Feel Life. But they revived it, or they kept it going. And they began with, there's a Pixies book that came out a while ago, but more recently there's one on Jay Dilla's Donuts that's coming out, if you're familiar with the hip-hop producer. And I'm particularly excited about his book because if you start to look at the names of these, Electric Ladyland, ABBA, Let It Be, this is not just classic rock, but it's rock in the classic sense. It's pop music in the classic sense. And one of the things that's been exciting about participating in this extended cohort of books is that my book doesn't have much in the way of vocals on it, and it certainly doesn't have much that would be commonly understood to be a song, though I would argue that they really are songs in their own right. And the Dilla record as well, he passed away some time ago. His record as well is a record that, while it has some vocal content, is much more of a rhythmic one. And so I think the two of ours are a nice addition to what had become a somewhat more circumspect vision of popular music. So it's it's a pleasure to just be able to push that just a little bit. The two records I think that have pushed the most previous to mine are, there's one about Throbbing Bristles, 20 jazz funk grades by Drew Daniel of Matmos, and there's one about DJ Shadows introducing. So those preceded mine and pushing that just a little bit. So before we get to the record, and my book, I just want to say, who the heck is this guy up on stage? So just a little bit about who I am and what I'm up to. I've written for tons of publications, including Nature, The Atlantic's website, Boing Boing. In fact, I think the first or second piece I ever wrote for Nature, just the first of three, I think, Stanford references I'm going to make while I'm down here, was about the artist Gail White, who teaches in the art school here. She's tenured. She wasn't when I wrote the article, and she's a really talented artist, and she's experimented a little bit with sound in some ways, but the work was more about the interaction of science and art. I'm best known, to the extent which I haven't known at all, is for this website which I founded in 1996. I'd been an editor of a music magazine from 89 to 96, and I left to join a website called citysearch.com in 96. And when I left, I started this website as a way to collect articles I'd already published. So when they became fish wrap, I stuck them up online, and whatever print publication I'd written for them had moved on to the next issue. But over time, people said, well, when are you writing your next article? And I had to explain, well, I'll post my next article on Display once I've written it for someone else, and then it's been long enough, and then I'll post it online. And that logic sort of went away, and I just started posting things online. Eventually, the word blog came around to explain this, but at the time, there was no word for it. We just sort of did it. I've been writing a lot of articles lately about artists from Northern California. If you're familiar with Mel Ramos, pop art painter, Gregory Condos, Joe Moment, and the cartoonist Adrian Tomina, who I'd worked with early on in his career. We're writing a series of articles about major art figures from Northern California for a magazine called Saptown. And I've had art displayed in galleries in Los Angeles, New York City. I collaborated with an artist named Paolo Salvagione on a piece that was at the Walhalla in Germany. And most recently, at a gallery in Dubai, I had a project that was about sound art and participated in the overarching piece about sound art. And lately, my primary focus in terms of my work beyond writing has been a class I teach. I'm teaching now for the fourth semester in a row a course about the role of sound in the media landscape at the Academy of Art in San Francisco. And he's teaching students how to listen and the role that sound plays and how objects and companies and services present themselves using sound, and then bring it back around and talk about how things that are sonic express themselves in non-sonic ways. That's the theme of the course. So I mentioned that I had, I think, 3 Stanford hometown references, and the first of which was having I mentioned Gal White many years ago. The next is this URL, which currently is not functioning. Had anyone ever gone to this before? I'm sure everyone's, this probably predates a lot of people. It no longer works, you don't have to check right now. This URL was a place where technomusic was discussed early on, and a student of Stanford at the time named Brian Bendeldorf, who was maybe familiar with him, he was one of the earliest participants in what became known as Apache. When Mosaic in '93 came out, and then a lot of those people moved to a little company called Netscape, a lot of the work they were doing went over and became Apache. And a lot of them vacated it in order to work on Apache. And folks from NASA and elsewhere began participating in building what now is the infrastructure for a good portion of the internet. Well, when he wasn't preceding that work, he was just going to lots of concerts and really being into electronic music. And he founded some mailing lists on this that it isn't just interesting that he did it, but they're actually a formative part of this conversation about what this album's cultural history is. I interviewed him at length for the book, and then we corresponded subsequent to that. This is a Spark station, if anyone recognizes it. Dusty little friend. This is the picture from Wikipedia. He explained that techno.stanford.edu was housed on this, and that Hyperial, excuse me, the name comes from a shaman song, if you remember the shaman, British Electronic Act. Hyperial.org is where he posted a bunch of email lists, IDM at hyperial.org and Ambient at hyperial.org. I have to force myself to pronounce it correctly. They were two very early 93, 94 expressions of enthusiasm for electronic music, just as the internet as we popularly know it was coming into being. It's very much a part of the story of this album's success that a lot of the early enthusiasm for it took place in a particular type of venue, which was an electronic one. And in fact, it was, even though it was based here at Stanford, this being the internet, it was not just Californian or even US students who were participating. And in fact, it was a physics student in Britain named Greg Eden, who will come back to the story in a little while, who was one of the many members of the discussion group who eventually played a not insignificant role in what we now know of this record. I'll unpack that shortly. So the Hyperial.org is actually on just a regular old PC running initially BSDI, but later FreeBSD. Around 1993 is when it was founded. So the book has 7 chapters in it, each of which approaches the record from different themes. I'm just going to walk through a few of them and then extrapolate from it. So some of this material's in the book, but much of it is more my thinking that went into the writing of the book. I'll be doing a bunch of readings for it, but this is a different sort of venue and it calls for a different sort of approach. So to begin with, my book is called Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. There is no volume 1. That's an important thing to explain on the first page because I didn't want anyone to wait to find the first one before they buy the second, which was actually my experience of the record. It's hard to recall this, and if you weren't there, it's hard to believe it was the case, but in 1993, 1994, when you went searching for or were learning about a record called Selected Ambient Works Volume 2, one of the first things you did was you go to your local record shop. And I was living in Sacramento at the time, but I frequently went down to the Bay Area and would say, can I get the first one? And they would hand you this thing called Selected Ambient Works 85 to 92, and you say, no, I want volume 1 first. And they'd say, no, there is no volume 1. so humorously, there's much humor in all this because there's so much confusion in it. Nothing's funnier than confusion. The idea of it being volume 1 has persisted to this day, and in fact, on one of the 2 websites operated by Warp Records, which is the releaser of most of Aphex Twin's music, and certainly the music used under that name. He has a bunch of pseudonyms. It refers to the previous record as Volume 1 in one of the brief little pithy things that probably an intern entered at some point into their database. The framing music for this is a pair of singles, which I'm not going to play for you because one of them is so violently loud that it might force you out of the room more quickly than my speaking pattern. But before this record came out, it was a single called On, and after it came out, a single called Ventilate, both of which were very rhythmic and much closer to the music that Aphex Twin has become known for over time. This record, on the other hand, is a very vaporous one, and the word vapor is pretty essential to people's understanding of it, and I employ it with some trepidation just because part of my goal is to convince people that this record actually has rhythmic curiosity to it, and the more I emphasize this idea of vapor, the more that I may undermine my own argument. But so this is just to play one track from it, a pretty central piece of my understanding of the album. This is an early track track on the record. Can you hear me out there? This is an early track on the record that's come to be known as White Blur 1. White Blur 1 is the one that, as it is untitled officially, but it is called White Blur 1 by fans, but more frequently it's the one with the wind chimes. In 1994, for a record released by Sire Records, home to Depeche Mode and Madonna, no disrespect, because they've both done their own interesting electronic explorations, this was a bit of a push for them. It's one of my favorite tracks on the record. That's pretty much all my favorite tracks. Ventolin was a really hard pounding track with a whine that's just incredible. People often wince when even the name is suggested. I think I'm seeing wincing in the audience. And then right after wincing, they talk about how amazing it is. It's a delectable experience. On was a little more poppy, but they created these two mountains of rhythmic distraction, which even further emphasized the quietude of this album. So I played a little bit of White Blur 1, and I just want to read now just a bit of the book, just to give you a sense of the kind of approach that I'm taking in. So this is from early on in it. This is from the introduction, well, from the first chapter, just a couple of pages. I'm talking now about this wind chime track. So forgive me as I look at my screen. At the near midpoint of Selected Ambient Works, Volume 2, a wind chime peeks through the album's lush and pervasive haze and makes itself heard. The chime appears as a sequence of routinized figments in the final track of the first of the album's two sides. That's track 11 of 23 for those of you listening at home to one of the US editions of the recording. It's track 12 of the editions of the album that have 24 or 25 tracks. A chart on page 126. I had to include a chart, it gets so complicated. There's actually two separate track listings of the album in the book because it gets so complex. With just one exception, the tracks that constitute Selected Ambient Works Volume 2 are officially untitled, in that they lack proper names, and this wind chime track is not the exception. We hear the wind chime, but we do not hear any of the actual wind. There's a brief passing moment of whizzy, slipstream sci-fi ether. It is like something that might accompany the jettisoning of waste or of a fallen colleague in deep space by an anonymous starship. This ether noise is synthesized, fleeting, false. The wind chime, by contrast, sounds real, even in the absence of wind. It's a wind chime resounding in a closed chamber, a specimen on clinical display. The chime introduces its characteristic rhythm. The device itself is nothing special. It's a standard issue. It's the same sort of wind chime that dangles from a neighbor's porch, situated fittingly right between a dream catcher and a flycatcher. Excuse me, between the mystic and the functional. The chime introduces the rhythm, but the rhythm is loose at best. It is a rhythmless rhythm in that it lacks a discernible downbeat. The chime cycles through its pattern and marvel of a unique phenomenon. The very patternlessness reveals itself as pattern. There is no beat in the traditional sense of a beat. What there is a series of beat-like segments that collectively suggest a kind of whole. In the place of meter, we have a metric temperament. The track depends on a droning, slowly developing tonal center for any sense of compositional undergirding. Yet in its seeming beatlessness, its harmonic drift, its largely synthetic raw material, the track still feels like a song. And like most any proper song, it has a vocal. But such as it is, that vocal is merely snippets of voices in plausible conversation. Plausible because the voices are garbled as if heard through the wall of the neighboring room. Even when this strange music agrees to speak, it muffles its message, and such is the nature of this remote pleasure, and an office delirious pleasure it is, of Aphex Twin's Selected Ambient Works Volume 2. I think I need a particular gesticulation for end caches. I think I'll just go like this in the future. The wind chime originates from a distant time, a time even further back than 1994. It relates to an object known to the ancient Greeks as the Aeolian harp, named in honor of Aeolus, the god of the wind. The wind chime is, by most accounts, the original generative instrument. It is the original device that serves dual essential purposes, as composition and as tool. To create a wind chime is to create a musical composition in physical form. It is to set down rules, the number, timbre, and relative proximity of notes, that when enacted by a player, by the wind, or if you tend toward the spiritual, perhaps by Aeolus himself, result in something sonorous, something melodic, something song-like. The remoteness of this something is, to borrow a term provided by another Greek myth, tantalizing. The wind is just one half of the beat's equation. The wind creates the rhythm as a pattern-like sequence, but it is the human imagination that recognizes that pattern-like sequence as something akin to a beat. In one of his oblique strategies cards, Brian Eno informed us that repetition is a form of change. These cards, a series of urbane, often counterintuitive artistic commands, were published by Eno, working with the late artist Peter Schmidt in 1975, the same year he released the early ambient music record, Discrete Music. The wind chime in Aphex Twin's music tells a contrasting story. If the chime had its own oblique strategies card, it might read, change is a form of repetition. The story that I'm trying to get there is the way that rhythm is played with on the record. And so in the earliest chapter, what I'm trying to do is emphasize the rhythmic curiosity, that while the record may not have beats in a traditional sense to many listeners, there is a standard rhythm to most of the tracks. And in fact, this track is the rare one where the rhythm is actually even remotely confusing. It's just that they're subtle, and there's other reasons why beatlessness is attributed to it, but what I really want to talk about during this talk is the way that the record has changed over time. And this is another aspect of this idea of repetition being a form of change. This is a photo of one of the early editions of the Oblique Strategies cards by Brian and Peter Schmidt. It is, in terms, I think, that there's, of all the things I discussed today, this is the most highly Googleable, I would say, after this talk is over, if you're not familiar with them already. So this idea of repetition being a form of change is especially interesting to this record because it has changed so much as time has passed. So much has happened to it through fan naming, the fact that most listeners to the record now use these fan-attributed titles, and most people who listen to the record now through MP3 players and through other digital services can isolate tracks in a way those of us who first experienced it on vinyl could not. The origins of discrete music, which released the same year he did these Oblique Strategy cards. I keep touching this like it's a totem, which I suppose it is. The story of discrete music is important to this. What happened was Eno was in an accident. It's been reported subsequently as a car accident, but it's not listed in the liner notes to the album. And he was bedridden, and a friend dropped by and said, I brought you some music to listen to. I'm going to put it on the turntable for you, but I got to take off. The person put the music on, took off, at which point Brian Eno has told the story many times. He experienced two things. First was he noticed that the speakers were at a very low volume, so he couldn't really hear it very well. On top of it, one of the speakers wasn't even functioning. So, and he was so weak from being ill or from being injured that he couldn't actually go and affect change on the stereo, so he was forced to listen to it. But being a curious thinker, he saw this not as a problem, but as a solution to a problem that had not yet been proposed to him, which is that this music was a really interesting way to explore sound, and he resolved, as he slowly got over his injury, that he would make music that sounded like this, that sounded like an album that had been recorded for this purpose, when in fact this record was intended to be listened to as a proper album. Discrete music is the album that came out of that. The ambient music that he created and the theme of it sort of cycled through what became known as ambient techno and then was revived in many ways by this record here. This idea of change, repetition being a form of change, coincides with the record's repetition, its listening over time, and how in the book I talked to a number of people who've used it professionally. If time allows, as the talk goes on, I'll touch on a number of these. Filmmakers have employed it in film, directors, sound designers, a number of choreographers have adopted a lot of his work, but several tracks from this have been adopted by an Israeli dance troupe, by a New York-based choreographer who herself attended Stanford. That's the third of my Stanford references for the day. The bingo card is full. And then also by an East Bay choreographic troupe called the Ray Savage Ensemble. It's also been most famously, I think, adopted by classical composers, and I'll get to them in a little bit of time. So this is a cover of the Street Music album, which I referenced. The definition that Brian Eno applied to ambient early on was that it was music that functioned as both foreground and background music. And the story of this record is a record that went from foreground to background as time passed. That was originally murky and unclear. Over time, as people focused their imaginations on it, became discernible as pattern. One of the weird things that came out of me writing this book is that it's no longer really background for me. A record that I could barely focus on when I first started listening to is now far too well known to me. I listen to it every day for a year when working on the book. My original experience of the record, though, was very much like Brian Eno's. I was not injured, but I could not make it out. It was when I first put that vinyl record on, and I would listen to it in '94 when it came out, I couldn't tell what I was listening to. I couldn't tell where one track ended and the next began. Like a lot of my favorite records, like Bitches Brew by Miles Davis, it is a record that I, at first, really had very little time for. I just struggled to listen to it. Now I can put on Dark Magus by Davis and just sort of sit back and read a book. When I first experienced that music, it was so catastrophic that I couldn't even make sense of it. This was in the opposite direction from a tonal point of view, but it took me a long time to even know where tracks began and ended. That, of course, is now ancient history. So to begin with, the synesthetic codex. I want to talk a little bit about the naming structure of the tracks and how that all came together. The inside cover of the album is a series of photographic images, each of which is associated with a different track. So each of the tracks on the record that is supposedly untitled isn't actually untitled, Aphex Twin at the time talked a lot about lucid dreaming, which among other people, William Gibson's talked about as being a source for creative production. He talked about this lucid dreaming state in which he would access areas of creativity and imagine tracks and then later on try to produce them. So rather than waking from a normal dream state where you sort of scramble to just try to write down a note or description of what you experienced, instead he would write about being in a state where you could actually compose in the dream state and be able to come out of it. Now, I must at some point in any discussion of Aphex Twin mention that he is famous for saying things that actually have no relationship to what actually he did. That said, I was in the course of researching this book able to find enough evidence of him reported it himself that he certainly was telling his story for a very long time to really be able to fake it. I interviewed him in 1996 when he released the follow-up record to this, Drugs. We didn't talk about lucid dreaming at length, but I did interview two individuals who work with him very closely professionally, and both of them talked about their experience firsthand of his lucid dreaming compositional strategy. One of them was his representative at Sire Records, and one of them was his representative at Chrysalis, his music publisher. So the interesting thing about this record being titleless is it depends on what you mean by a title, because the tracks each was associated directly with an image, and those images simply gave birth to the titles as we know them. One thing I wonder about is if you want to do this today, if you simply would have a little iPod app or a little Android app where you just clicked on the pictures, because it's really not that dissimilar. It's just that back then you had to walk across the room and look at the picture and figure out what it was going to be. I'll get to this picture in a second. This is what I'm talking about. This is a detail from the inside cover. Each of these represents a side of the LP, originally 3 LPs, the number of tracks on it, and then you can tell which track it was based on this. So this is the image that later on got known as Radiator. That's how it all came together. Domino, lichens. There were two. There was two that looked like white blur, so one became white blur 1, white blur 2. How that happened, I'll get to shortly. So among the many people I tracked down for this were two individuals who participated in the list that originated on a server on this campus, which are Alan Perry and Greg Eden. Alan Perry and Greg Eden were both major participants on the IDM and Ambient list, and Perry actually was the originator of the list. IDM stands for Intelligent Dance Music, and it's a term that's both treated with derision and enthusiasm, depending on the party. So the term aside, which is a political thing, I just want to sort of avoid as best I can for now. I deal with it in the book more directly. But what's interesting about it is the heatedness of the discussion on the Aphex Twin list. And in fact, the enthusiasm for Aphex Twin's music on the list was so extreme that at some point the members of the list decided they might have to create a separate list just to get the Aphex Twin out of it so they could talk about Seafield and they could talk about all these other musicians they were excited about at the time. What I discovered talking about Alan Perry is that they weren't entirely mistaken, that in fact the enthusiasm for Aphex Twin was built into the list to begin with. It was actually originally going to be simply an Aphex Twin list. And then he was convinced by Brian, who I mentioned earlier, the later an Apache developer, to broaden its scope. But despite that, the palimpsest of its planning sort of snuck through. Greg Eden is the other main person I spoke with, and the reason I spoke with him is he is the individual responsible for the naming of these tracks. He's the individual who on the list one day said, I'm having trouble with these, and it's available on hyperreal.org. If you go, the whole archives are there and you can search through them. Though I've done most of that dirty work for you. He said, I went through the list, here are the tracks, and this is what I'm referring to. And he just did it for his own take. And the reason I explored this was because I was really intrigued by the role that fans played at a very early date in changing our understanding of it. When the Orbital Sound Ensemble, the classical music ensemble based in Brooklyn, when they initially took his music a decade after it's released and transcribed it for classical chamber ensemble and played it as classical music, they were really transforming people's understanding of the sounds. But in fact, as early as weeks after its release, people were already altering understanding of it, already tripping tracks. It would have been an amazing story if a crowdsourced activity across the globe had come together to do this, but in fact, there was one dude over in England working off a server on this campus. Attributing names, getting a little bit of feedback from the group, a handful of people from around the world, and then that sort of becomes, it's sort of stuck ever since. I actually got hate mail about the book before I ever wrote a word of it, because someone approached me and said, don't you dare use the track titles in this book. And unfortunately, I did throughout the book, which I explained at length in the book, because if I didn't, it would have been very difficult to explain what track I'm talking about. Because once you get past track 4, the tracks vary depending on which edition it is. And once you get past track 19 or 20, when the second rarity track comes in, it gets even more confusing. So Eden himself later went on to work at Warp. So he was just a fan who was a physics student who did very little work in physics, apparently, by his own telling. At one point, the second most popular, Newcastle, he went to school in Newcastle. The second most popular webpage on the Newcastle website during period in the early to mid-90s was a discography of the record label War. He created this discography initially just for his own use, because he just was going into record stores like many of us did at the time, and you walk into a record store and I couldn't pick up my phone and be like, oh shoot, do I have this 12-inch? I don't know, and I'll just, or what is this exactly? You can go to discogs.org today and just check it out and see what you're missing. Back then, I had like a little list of every Nick Lowe record in my pocket, because I'd walk into a record store and be so excited I might forget that I actually had this rare Nick Lowe single. And God forbid you like Billy Childish at the time, because the guy released hundreds and hundreds of singles, and keeping track of those in my head was actually impossible. Well, Greg Eden made this list for himself. Today, that sort of collective discographic activity is well known. It eventually became known as Wikipedia. At the time, this sort of activity was a much more nuanced and fledgling activity, and tracking that growth, tracking the way that individuals would collectively contribute information to a well and then figure out a way to share that was a really interesting thing to go back to. And it's a big part of the origin of this record, a big part of the era that it came out of. And one day, while working on the record, I decided I needed to buy another copy of it. I already had the vinyl, I already had a CD, I had a dub of a cassette that I could listen to. But I wanted to buy a digital version. I had digital versions I'd written myself, so I went to iTunes. And I logged on and I plugged in my iPod Touch, and I was confused to find that the track titles that Greg Eden, among these other people, had contributed to the tracks were on iTunes. And iTunes, I mean, as closed systems go, Apple was pretty synonymous with that. So the fact that this fairly well-received record that sold hundreds of thousands of copies still has these unofficial track titles, that seemed like the most un-Apple experience I could have. And I began to look around, and I found that lots of systems had the track titles like that. Some would have the official correct titles, which was 1 through 25 with only one track number 13 with a title in caps. Others would have all the fan titles. Sometimes there were different fan titles. And because one of the tracks is titled Rolled, which in Britain has a U in it, and here it doesn't, there were even alternate versions of these alternate titles. So I did the following. I called Apple, and I said, I just want to talk to someone in the PR department, media department, just to see if they have a sort of professional response to this. It's not surprising I never heard back. Again, closed system, this is not a surprise. What was interesting was that a week later, the record disappeared from Apple's server, and actually for about 3 months, the record was not available for sale through Apple and iTunes in the US. It was available in the UK. And it came back just a few weeks ago, about a month ago, and it was, and suddenly all the track titles had gone back to the official titles, which is untitled throughout. I don't think my phone call started that, but the coincidence in timing was quite remarkable. What it did yield more than just this anecdote, though. What it led me to do is to contact a company called Gracenote. Are you all familiar with Gracenote? Gracenote is an incredible database of songs and also of television shows. And if you ever put a CD, fairly archaic media you may be aware of, into a computer, you would immediately be able to pull up the tracks on it. The reason that happened was not because there was an ISBN number of sorts on the CD that was pulling up official track titles, but because they themselves had a database that was largely fueled not just by official information, but by fan-fed information. So initially when Gracenote was building its database, you entered a CD that no one else had entered in before, you could yourself add titles. And over time, systems were put in place. So I thought, wow, this is pretty interesting. If back in '93, some guy who's having gotten his physics reading done in Newcastle had attributed these songs originally, who is entering these titles now? So I got in touch with Gracenote, and they were far more responsive than Apple, and immediately someone got on, and I had a very lengthy conversation with one of the top editors there, talked me through their whole system, and we, between us, reverse engineered what we think was going on. It's quite a substantial chunk of the book. What it comes down to is this. You put a CD in the player, and you reject the opportunity to enter data, that's one thing. But if you just hit enter, 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 and just give it all null, then it's going to receive that. And if you do that for this record, because there are no titles, lots of people are going to think they're entering in the official titles, but in fact, the system is programmed to ignore null entries. So, a decade before this was put in place, 20 years before it was having the ramifications I was experiencing, this system somewhere along that line came along that was directly, its exact programming was set up to reinforce the unofficial track titles. That took a lot more time to unpack with discussing it with her, and she dug deep into the database and found all the different editions of it, and she was she was alarmed but also humored by it. But this led to yet another learning, which was such an exciting thing about this process, which is that Gracenote is exploring a step beyond. So the kid who wrote me the note who threatened my life if I used the titles, he's, I mean that jokingly, by the way. He was a bit perturbed though. He was onto something, because not only is there the issue of these varying titles for it, but Gracenote's going a step further with the way that they recognize information, which is that if you are in your car now, in certain systems that are fueled by Graysmith, and you say, I want to listen to a song by The Boss, it will recognize that. It has a voice-activated receptor that can trigger your store of songs on your iTunes, or that's in a hard drive, or that's available through a service like Pandora. So, well, not Pandora, because you can't request a song through RDO or through Spotify. If you say The Boss, it knows that by The Boss you mean. And so their database is actually going in exactly the direction that Mold and Lycan and all these fan names went, which is that we don't go in conversation and say, oh, did you enjoy the new song by the Rolling Stones? Did you enjoy the new record by, whomever? Every band, to some extent, has its fan name, and their system is going in that direction as well. So in a way, their system is perfectly defined for what we've come to understand as being this Aphex Twin record. I was going to show you some screenshots of all the different. It's amazing to this day. In fact, if you go to the Warp Records site right now, there's 2 different ways to buy the record through their site, and they have 2 different track listings for the record. One of them is all untitled, and one of them through Bleep, which is their online record store that they founded with the Savage Republic, not Savage Republic, the band, I can't remember the name of the design firm, but in any case, there they actually have Blue Calc singled out as a track title. So even the record label can't get it correct, which I think is ultimately what's really correct, which is that there's no official version. So the way that the tracks have been named over time is part of the story of the record, and in the early experience of a group of individuals on a mailing list, prefigured how databases would actually mediate how culture is consumed and how culture is named and codified and experienced. Then there's other ways, more direct, more individual, more driven by an individual's point of view as to how this record has changed over time. In the book, I explore them through 2 different chapters, which I'm going to give an outline of now and explore some of the thinking in them. One is called Transcribing Vapor, and the other is called Embedding Vapor. Transcribing Vapor is about individuals who have taken this music, which is heard to be largely vaporous and figment-like, and have figured out what each track sounds like. So just to remind you of the sort of music we're talking about, this is a track called Mole off the record. This is a second track called Grass. Oh, this is actually a good example. Next time someone tells you this album is beatless, ask them what they meant, how this is beatless. But there's melodic material on the record as well, not just rhythmic. This is a track called Cliffs with Wish It Opens. And it's one of 2 tracks that were transcribed by the composer Caleb Burns for the group Along with Sound. I kind of feel for my fellow authors in the 33 and the 30 series, because I've written one of the few records that I can play continuously in the background while I write a bed. I mean, if this was about the Ramones, I just have to keep stopping it, but I can just let it play the whole time. So this is a track called Cliffs, which is one of the 2 most referenced tracks on the record, probably just because it's the first one. In many ways, you could think of the album as just one long track, and this is simply the beginning of it. It's really beautiful. It's one of the 2 tracks that Along with Sound transcribed for the record Acoustica, which was released in 2005. But before they even released it back in 2003, when versions of the music were starting to be made available as they were working on it, I interviewed Alan Pearson, who at the time was one of the founders of Along with Sound, and who was just beginning to get composers together for the project. Bizarrely, simultaneously in England, Warp Records was working directly with the London Philharmonic to do a very similar thing. And so 2 separate sets of composers, often from opposite sides of the pond, were involved with these 2 different ventures to take work from the Warp catalog and transcribe it. Originally, the Along with Sound project was going to be like the London Philharmonic's project, and be lots of different artists from that milieu, from the Warp milieu, from the Warp roster. But in the end, they went just with Aphex Twin, whereas Warp explored Square Fisher and others, Ports of Canada. So I interviewed a bunch of composers at the time, and I actually didn't interview the composer who did these 2 tracks, but I spoke with Alan Pearson, and I spoke with the composers who worked both on the Philharmonic side and on the Along with Sound side, and talked about how they were able, in these sounds, able to transcribe them for traditional instruments. And then, that was back in 2003, and then when I was writing this book, I actually spoke at Caleb Burns about it, and talked about his experience of taking these tones and figuring out ways to convince traditional instrument players to present them. Several things came out of this. One of them was just what the nature of a traditional instrument was. Because he was one of the people at Alarm Sound who came up with the idea to do the project in the first place. And yet when he went out to start doing the transcription, he said, oh, wow, I'm going to have a bunch of reverb, and I'll play the instruments, and I'll be able to accomplish these sounds. And his fellow Alarm Sound member said, not to go all straight edge on you, but that's not the point. The point is to reproduce those electronic effects themselves. Not to say, oh, the beat is the instrument, the electronic effect is something I can add afterwards, but take the entirety of the composition and treat that as the thing to transcribe. This didn't turn him off the project, didn't even make him switch the tracks he planned to do, but it was a mental shift that to this day is a great way to emphasize what we think of as music and what we think of as effect, what we think of as composition, what we think of as arrangement or instrumentation. Now, the chapter's quite long, so I just want to cut to the chase on this one, which is that every time people write about, well, not every time, often when people write about the merging of electronic music and classical music, one of the things that happens, especially when electronic artists are seen on the same roster, especially young electronic artists are seen on the same roster as what seems more traditional or canonical artists, there's often this sort of like when you read out comics, it says, Biff Bang Zoom, oh wow, comics aren't just for kids. The equivalent of that is, wow, Mozart and Aphex Twin, who would have thunk? But one of the interesting things that you figure out as you go back into this is that this music being transcribed for acoustic instruments is not a matter of a trajectory that's continuing one direction. In many ways, it's the history of ambient music coming full circle. Because if you're familiar with record discrete music, half of it is the music that was directly intended to reflect the experience that Eno had when he was on his sickbed, when he was injured. But the other half of it is reworkings of Pachelbel's canon. One of the texts of ambient music is, in fact, restructuring classical music. That's where it started. So it's exciting to track that down, and I'm not doing it justice by summing it up in one sentence with a semicolon in the middle of it, but following that track of thought and making the recognition that, in fact, what Alarm Sound was doing was actually fulfilling the origin point of the music and not sort of helping Aphex Twin and his cohort move on up in culture, but in fact just being part of a whole was really interesting to me. And that sort of perceived sort of gap between high culture and low culture is one that isn't as important now, but I think I am myself just generationally marked by it. I was born in '66, I graduated from college in '88. In fact, it was weird coming here. I was reflecting on my college experience. I started off as a computer science major, and I was looking at some videos of people who've spoken here before, just to get a sense of the room and the tone and the sort of information that's transmitted. And I studied with Alan Perlis, who won the first Turing Prize. He was a professor of mine my first semester before my head exploded, and I decided becoming an English major was probably going to be better for my health. And then I studied with Serge Lang after that. I was like, well, computer science is going to kill me, so maybe linear algebra is okay. And I made it through that class, and I took physics of sound, and then I stuck to literature. But it was a good early experience of it, and Perlis was an amazing, amazing instructor. I want to now go on to the embedding vapor part of the story, which is the way that creative individuals like composers, like directors and choreographers have themselves employed music in their own work. Just one note on that transcribing vapor. While the chunk of the book that's about the way that people have transcribed the music, it focuses on classical, I also interviewed two individuals, Andrew Flanders, who's based in, I think, Portland, and James Devane, if you're familiar with him. He's a pretty accomplished musician in San Francisco. Both of them separately took a piece of music called Rhubarb and transcribed it for acoustic guitar. It's a really beautiful thing. I think because I don't think I want to play their versions now. I just want to play a little bit of this and just let the idea of this having been This is a track that two individuals with no contact between them said to themselves one day, I'm just going to sit down and transcribe that for guitar. One of the challenges about writing about music is that there is melody in it, but the melody is so, I don't want to say insignificant, it's just quiet. It is significant. In fact, it's near stasis is what makes it so formidable. I'm no musicologist, but my experience of this track is as follows. It starts off with a 5-note phrase, and by the end it's a 6-note phrase. And at some point, that note is added. I don't know when it happens, it's hard to discern, because once you hear it the first time, you hear a shadow of it the first time you experience the music. And at the end, when the note slowly disappears, it's not that it's no longer there, it's that there's now a void where there had previously been a note. It's a really beautiful experience. listen to this for a little while. So I spoke with a bunch of composers and filmmakers and with a bunch of choreographers and so forth. Key among them were two directors. I talked to, Aphex Twin's music's been used in a lot of films. Not so much this album, though it's appeared in a bunch of them, but his track Avril 14 has been used by a lot of different filmmakers. It was sampled by Kanye West. This is from a later record. It was in the movie Her, which Spike Jonze just released. It was used in the trailer for that. And it is sort of like, it seems almost like a divorce drama, but his former wife, Sofia Coppola herself, has used it in her films. So it seems like there's a kind of like a mutual challenge for cultural ownership there. So maybe she'll use it again soon. I spoke with Jordan Melamed, who directed a film called Manic, which came out in the early 2000s, and with Lucy Walker, who directed a film called The Devil's Paradise. And they're really good, really interesting films to put side by side for comparison, because they have a lot in common. They're both about troubled young people, but they have a lot of differences, and those differences end up being able to amplify the role that the music plays in the films. Because they both employ almost the exact same tracks. Clips in particular plays a prominent role in both films. Lucy Walker's film is called The Devil's Paradise, and it's one of the first explorations of Rumspringa, the Amish period where around the time you're 16, you're sort of forced out into the world and told, well, if you survive, you can come back and join the faith, but if you're tempted by it, don't worry about it. It was nice knowing you. And while it's sort of an intriguing thing when you watch it on film, it's absolutely terrible. And the drug use and the self-doubt, and I veer away from the word dark because it's far too easy shorthand, but the darkness of that experience is quite intense. And so her story is about troubled youth, and it's a reality film. It's a documentary. Jordan Melamed directed a film called Manic, which, if anyone's seen the film 500 Days of Summer, that stars, it's a very witty film that stars Joseph Gordon-Levitt and Zooey Deschanel. Well, a decade before they were coupled in that film, they played a couple in a film called Manic, which is about, as the title suggests, young people who suffer from mental concerns, who are all in a group home / I don't know the polite terms for it, but with the typical post-Cuckoo's Nest troublesome guards, but a benevolent overseer played by Don Cheadle. And what's intriguing about the use of the music in both films is how different it goes. The exact same music, troubled kids in totally different direction. In the film and I interviewed both directors at length about this, in the Jordan Melamed film Manic, it's the music that represents the male character, Joseph Gordon-Levitt's peacefulness. Every time he's in a scene where he's thinking about getting out of there and his sense of the future, that's the music you hear. You hear some track from the record. And as if to make a kind of emphasis on what's in the character's head, at one point you hear one of the more rhythmic tracks, Boy Girl, from a later Aphex Twin album. You hear that during a basketball scene, and it's emphasizing that it's a distinct, even the same musician can provide a distinct, there's a lot of energy and anger on the basketball court, which is distinct from the experience of these characters looking momentarily into their future as being a happy thing, which, as you might imagine, is not a common occurrence in the film. On the other hand, in the film Devil's Paradise, the use of the music is this ominous presence. And it serves a weird series of roles in the film. The primary one is the sound of modernity. It is the hum. This is very much music that if played with a less than sympathetic audience, someone might ask if there's a drone, if something's in the next room, or if there's like a short circuit. And the droning quality of this music in the film by Lucy Walker has the sense that a really great thinker about music, about sound, Gordon Hempton, if you're familiar with him, Gordon Hempton, the field recordist, there's a great documentary film about him called Soundtracker. He's a very accomplished guy who records nature sounds for documentary films. And he has this term, the American mantra, which is his term for the hum. Right now, that room tone, which is not just the room, but it's all the electrical current, that hum that pretty much wherever you are, you hear the tone of it, the hum that comes from electrical wires, for him that's the American mantra. And he means it in the negative. In the film, this music is a slightly more musical version of that. It is in these Irish communities, in Pennsylvania is where this one was filmed, but there's others elsewhere in the country. You see the wires in the horizon. The Amish property is huge, but it's not so huge that they don't see the towers on the horizon. And this is the music that seems to emanate from those towers. Interestingly, though, it plays a secondary role in the film as well, which is that since everyone's left the campus, since everyone's left the community at some point in their lives and come back, they all have experienced music firsthand. And at times in the film, you meet these older Amish who talk with fondness of their memories of music. Oh yes, I really did enjoy that during that time. And it was a particular challenge to the director when she made the film as to what kind of music to use. And this was an interesting, a chunk of the book that I'm just going to touch on a sentence or two, which is just that she realized early on that she was going to need music for film and wondered what she would do, but she didn't realize at first didn't fully get that the Amish didn't have music themselves to employ. There's a kind of spoken singing that they do during their religious services, but otherwise they had no music to contribute to background music. She thought, oh, I'll use an acoustic guitar. But it's not that the Amish don't have electricity, it's that they don't have technology, and they don't have music. There was nothing that was going to represent it well. So this music that is both unmusical and musical serves that role. Which is one last note before I move into the choreography. I'm going to show you a bit of choreographed work. An interesting thing about the use of the film of music is this, which is that usually when you hear a pop song in a film, it's playing a role. It's usually a worldized thing, to use Walter Murch's term, where you're experiencing it from the point of view of the person, or it's playing over a montage, where it's playing the role of a kind of narrative in music for what's happening. Oh, the two lovers are running down the beach. Here they are going through their lives. What's interesting about the use of this music in the film is that it is from the pop realm, but it serves a role more as score. And in fact, in the Joseph Gordon-Levitt starring film, Manic, there is someone who is cited as a composer on the film, but in fact, I think by minute, Aphex Twin's music is about 50% of it even then. So this is a fellow, well, for you fellow, I didn't go here, but a fellow graduate, Corey Marquis, who graduated from Stanford many years ago, and she is a choreographer who is part of the Doug Eakins ensemble in New York. But she has her own practice as well, and I'm going to show you just a little bit of a student production she did when she was here at Stanford. If I can move my mouse this way. There we go. Come on, don't disappear on me. There we go. Sorry. A little technical. This should play. Just keeps disappearing. Come on. There we go. It's pretty low res. It's just two figures on stage. And there's two more dancers coming in. Distraction talk while it's playing. So what's going on in this piece is that there's four dancers you'll eventually see, and there's 2 men and 2 women, both paired in yellow and red. So you have 2 men in red, 2 women in red, a man and a woman in yellow and red, etc. And the piece is, in the piece, if you study it, what happens is that each of them has their own emotions, and as they interact with the others, they pick up bits of the other. And it's a kind of human sampling. It's sampling of motion. And she studied here with, her name is Diane Frank, who's in the dance department here. And Diane Frank herself had been on the teaching staff at Merce Cunningham's dance ensemble before coming to Stanford. And so Corey Marquis' experience of electronic music in the studio was very much informed by Diane Frank's experience with John Cage's music, of course, through his lifelong association partnership with Merce Cunningham. And in addition, she brought Brian Eno and even stuff as contemporaries and books into the classroom. So her experience with electronic music came out of that. This was a huge learning experience for me writing the book, and really one of the most exciting things that I experienced, because I wrote the book in part to challenge myself, to find out new things, and to dig deep into something that was familiar to me and find the unfamiliar buried inside of it. I knew nothing about modern dance. I know about as much about modern dance as I knew about football, which was zero. And one thing that was fascinating about it for me was that as someone who's music focused and sound focused, I just assumed this is how your choreograph will work. You get a nice piece of music, and you figure out how it works, and not unlike how the transcribers worked with the classical stuff, you find things that fit it, you find motions that fit it. It's totally not how it happens. The vast amount of contemporary dance begins as kinetic action. It begins as exploring the human body in space. Then, only after a certain amount of that's been cemented, does one really begin the exploration for music. And so a lot of this motion was already determined before this piece of music was decided upon. Just a side note, because I still speak with M dashes, even though they're not useful. This is not the original version of the track, this is the Alongo Sound version. And it goes to the point that the music's continued expansion into listenership and its changing meaning over time is largely informed by its use by people. So she may never have used this piece had it not come to her via Alongo Sound. So what I learned in the process was that the way that this works is that you compose the dance, then you find music that's attributable. And I quote her at length in the book about what made this music just absent enough to work on the stage, and just present enough to be more than just clean cut, and more than just sound for its own sake. I spoke with another choreographer, well, not another choreographer, I corresponded with another choreographer, but I ended up talking directly with her sound designer. Her name's Sharon Ayal. She's very accomplished. She's been doing work professionally for a quarter century. She worked with the Bat Shiva ensemble in Israel for a long time, and now has her own group with two other people, one of whom is a sound designer. So I talked with him about the use of another track, Shiny Metal Rods, in a piece they have called Bill, which is named for Bill Viola. But I won't go into detail on that here. Pretty much, sometimes people ask me like who I would have liked to interview for the book. Well, I interviewed Aphex Twin back in the day, as they say. I interviewed people who worked at the record label. I interviewed the person who signed to Desire Records. I interviewed a lot of musicians and filmmakers I've worked with. I think the first person I'd love to have spoken to, and maybe I will someday, is a British comedian named Chris Morris, you may be familiar with. He's known for Blue Jam. He did Jam and Blue Jam, which were a series of comedic shorts, initially radio, then film. And he very early on figured out that this music makes a great backdrop, a great unsettling backdrop. Again, it's so interesting because this in a Chris Morris piece would be deeply unsettling, whereas here it's quite lovely. But I did not, with my year-long deadline I set myself, manage to get to it. So, just to begin to bring it to a close, because I was going to give myself just an hour to speak. Actually, I'm only just an hour to speak. I just want to talk just a little bit more about what I do and how that relates to this research. So this is SoundCloud, you're probably familiar with. This is a group that I organized on SoundCloud back in January of 2012. It's called the Disquiet Junto. The Junto comes from a group that Benjamin Franklin put together in 1727, which is a collective for mutual philosophical improvement. Basically a bunch of guys sitting around drinking beer, talking about big ideas. I was reading Walter Isaacson's biography about Benjamin Franklin when I had this idea to try to take the curated music work I'd done by getting a bunch of musicians together and saying, hey, would you do a piece based on this theme, and doing something a little more open-ended. And so on the 1st January of 2012, I put a compositional prompt out on SoundCloud and some other social network services and just said, please record the sound of ice in a glass and make something of it. And much to my surprise, within 4 days, there were 40, 50 tracks that musicians from around the world. That's 40, 50 different musicians, because I said you can only upload one track. Occasionally we get 40 enthusiastic participants. But 40 to 50 different musicians from around the world that contribute. As of earlier this week, there's over 3,000 tracks by over 400 contributors to over 111. And I mention this for two reasons. One is rumor has it that various people in this room might actually like to make music, so this is a little opportunity. I think this is the point where my publisher wants me to say, oh, please go buy my book, but what I'm actually going to say is please go make some music. But I bring it up more specifically because a key area for my research of my ideas in working on the book was not just doing interviews and not just doing reading and archival work and listening closely and writing about it, but it was using the group to explore some of the thematic ideas. And so occasionally I would pitch an idea to the group, like I was really intrigued by these pixel-sized beats that were barely perceptible. And I would assign a project to the group and just say, without mentioning Aphex Twin, please just, here's a compositional prompt in which this is an idea, let's see what comes of it. And I wouldn't even highlight the idea per se, I would just put it out there as a prompt just to see what came of it. Some of the ideas were so close to my writing that I didn't dare do it because I was concerned about disrupting my own writing process, because this was not a project that was done when it was done. This is a project that was like years up, turning the manuscript. I needed to get this thing done. And I defined it as such. So after the project was done, I did a project where I said to the group, let's go back to the wind chime track. And some of these projects are multi-steps long. A lot of it's influenced by Oulipo and by Fluxus, the role of creative restraint to get a project done. My restraint for this book was a year. This creative restraint is a little more specific. We did one for William S. Burroughs' 100th birthday where we took clips of newspapers and cut them up and made songs out of them and so forth. A lot of the projects are like 10 steps long. Take the source material, do this, and so forth. So a lot of subtractive synthesis and other things. For this project, I had one sentence. It was back to this very sort of creative impulse that formed the group in the first place, which was simply use the sound of a wind chime as the rhythmic foundation for a track. That's all I said. And I was amazed by what came out of it. I'm just going to play a couple of bits of some of the tracks that came out of it. We ended up with 39, 40 different tracks from musicians responding to this one sentence. Really beautiful things came out of it. intrigued about the way that culture changes over time. The theme of this talk is this idea of cultural change being a form, cultural afterlife. The idea that something has meaning after it's released. That once something is launched into the world, each person who experiences it becomes a co-author of that work. It's the way that things have changed over time. And I reflected on things like how composers such as Steve Reich and Philip Glass have talked about how, as time has gone on, they've realized that symphonies, and especially chamber ensembles, have become more and more accustomed to playing their music. Not simply because they've played it longer and longer, but because there's become a culture in which that music is the norm. If anyone's ever read any science fiction by Kim Stanley Robinson, he has a great book called 2312, which takes place 300 years in the future, in which Philip Glass music is so popular that when you're in a symphony hall, it becomes like the Messiah sing-along when you go to Christmas. The entire audience sings along with Satyagraha. I've seen community theater versions of his operas, but that still is at least 300 years away, I would say. But the idea that the music can become more familiar as time passes, and Reich and Glass and Nyman and a lot of those composers who were early on in minimalism have talked about how these new ensembles just get it. But they don't get it just because they've studied at the feet of the masters. They get it because it's part of the culture. And the fact that these big things become part of the culture is the reason it sounds a little much alien and very fluid and vaporous to us become much more knowable. And one of the things that was intriguing to me was like what this same assignment would have gotten 20 years ago. I don't know, I can't go back, but it'll be intriguing, another decade hence to see again where the culture goes. So just to close it up, I just want to say thanks very much. I think it's appropriate that at the end I list my varieties of places beside my home address where I exist. This is my main hang, and this is where you can reach me. I post daily at disquiet.com, and I've been exploring a lot of the ideas of books subsequently. As I mentioned, the book's 35,000 words. I actually wrote another 45,000 in the process of working on the book, which I'm slowly piecing together into something publicly presentable that goes up on it. But I do welcome you if any of you want to join the Disquiet Hunter project. That'd be great. It's been really an honor and a pleasure to talk at CCRMA, which has been such a central place for my imagination for me to go, also to get resources once in a while too. So thanks very much.
We can take some questions and we can have some food afterwards as well. Anybody have any questions?
I hate to be the one to ask about gear, but one of the things I've researched Aphex Phonology made a big impression on my life. And it's hard to find what tools he used.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you came across any of that information in your research.
Yeah. Well, to begin with, it's not the focus of the book, and it's largely not the focus of the book because I'm myself very gear disabled. I frequently, when I do projects, the person who writes up the description of what I do says, composer marketing, I'm musician marketing. I just don't make music. I mean, I think in a meta sense I do because I'm creating these fluxusy compositions that are then like we had 71 people made a piece of music based on one of these projects. So music's coming out of my work, but I explore it. I play with Borderlands, I play with Sampler, but it's something I'm intrigued by, and I frequently talk to people who make instruments, but I don't myself actually pursue it heavily. Which is say through my own use. And so when I started this project, had I done a different record, I would definitely have talked to people. I mean, I think my writing about I point to my laptop as if that means anything. This is where the text was. So I think it's clear from my talk about the wind chime that I'm fascinated by the idea of a generative instrument. And so I interview frequently software engineers to talk about what they do. But when I talk to musicians, I can't have that repartee that another practitioner can have. In fact, when I first started writing about electronic music intensely in like 94, I'd say, I would always ask every person the same question, which is, if you could make any instrument, what would you make? And Aphex was among the people who answered that question. Because at the time, it seemed like a necessary question because there was the equipment was limited, it was knowable. I didn't understand the tools were going to come around, software tools that would make making an instrument be itself a very complicated question to figure out what it means in the first place. And then I later on was excited to see that the rise in software did not actually do away with physical interfaces, but then there's been this sort of homebrew technology revival. Aphex Twin is not the most reliable narrator of his own life. He's a guy who kind of like takes the piss out of everything by all appearances. My experience interviewing him was that he was either incredibly deadpan or incredibly open. I'd been warned in advance of speaking with him that he could be very, very rude, that he could be a very tough interview, and I should just not get my hopes up very high. And that had happened to me in the past. The worst experience I ever had was with Keith Rowe, a guitarist. I love Keith Rowe's music, and I was a huge fan, and I called him up, he answered the phone, and as far as I could tell, he then dangled the phone and played guitar until I decided to hang up. But I do have that recording, which is pretty cool. When I interviewed Aphex Twin, I picked up the phone, he said hello, and then the phone line went dead. I went, God, I'm gonna get like some music, at least Keith Rowe played for me. And then he called back a second later and apologized. And he was incredibly friendly. I learned a lot of stuff about him. But in terms of instrumentation, there's a lot more talk out there about what he didn't do than what he did do. There's pictures of synthesizers where you realize the tool he said he made, in fact, was something that he had purchased. There is talk that there was a Richard D. James on the Super Collider list, and apparently if you want to dive into the Super Collider list, which I began to do, but the decade of hyperreal is really sufficient for my purposes, there is information there supposedly about his coding, but I can't confirm it.
But you know, just the Wikipedia entry, there's a huge list of gear on that.
There is, but there is a huge list of gear, but it's also, I'm a huge fan of Wikipedia, so I'm not the person who's going to immediately go to but it's Wikipedia, but it's Aphex Twin.
Yeah.
Which is to say, the reference points themselves, just because he said it to a journalist doesn't mean it was true.
Yeah. Well, most of it is pretty familiar to anybody who does electronic stuff. So.
Yeah, you can hear the tones in it, you
Yeah.
can recognize the equipment, which frustrates the fan base that has built up this story that he himself contributed to, that he made it all himself.
Yeah.
What is he up to now?
He's been doing music. One of the interesting, well, the short answer to that is that he's doing work with remote-controlled large ensembles of instruments, of musicians. And so there's work he did in Poland a few years ago that apparently he's going to do again, where it's a remote-controlled orchestra of some sort. Almost everyone I interviewed for this project talked about it in the past tense, which was sad to me because I was born in ’66. He was born in '71. I mean, he's many years to make music left. In fact, in classical music terms, he's still a young person. But everyone I talked with talked about it in the past tense. I've heard various stories, none of which I have any basis to believe are true. But one thing I can report, though, is simply this, which is that people who worked closely with him got the sense, didn't get the sense, they knew this was an individual who was excited to not have to be in the public eye. That the more he was able to accomplish as a professional musician who could support himself and explore what he wanted to do, the better. Going on tour was not an exciting thing, it was a means to an end. And once he realized he could license his work out, once he realized he could do work for advertisements and for film directly, the less he had to tour, the less he had to get on the road, the better. I mentioned that in 1994, the year the record came out, Kurt Cobain passed away, he killed himself, barely a month after the record came out. And in fact, the story goes, and I have it from a reputable source, I quoted in the book, didn't experience it firsthand, but the gist is that Aphex Twin was supposedly a month after the release of the record due to be on the cover of a major British music magazine, at which point Aphex Twin passed away. Kurt Cobain passed away, and apparently he was, the phrase in the book was weird, in a twisted, weird way, relieved to not be on the cover. That Kurt Cobain pushing him off the cover was a form of relief for him. And in fact, his public appearances diminished. But again, this is a guy who's famous for putting contorted images of his face on buxom women and being in his videos myriad times and putting his face in his own music. So he's not shy, but maybe he's mostly shy when he's able to mediate people's experience of him through media rather than live and in person.
But as a human being, he's a recluse basically.
Yeah, I mean,
Like he doesn't come and talk like this.
I don't really, he doesn't talk very much, no. But I should also say that I'm not the best narrator of that part of the story because people's biography is not really exciting to me. Reading Benjamin Franklin's biography was awesome, but the guy was so horrible to his family, it was like really hard to balance with his incredible accomplishments. On the one hand, one of America's great inventors, on the other hand, I mean, just not the model family man. Great creative societies, except societies the size of a nuclear family.
Long time ago, I went to Merce Cunningham show and talked to the sound man. And he was going around flushing the toilets in the auditorium and recording sound. And I asked him, how are you going to coordinate that with the dancers who have already done their thing? And he said, we don't.
Yeah, those chance interactions, and I knew that because I'd read Silence. I knew about their association. I'd studied with people who'd worked with them in college myself, but it took talking to the choreographer at length to really get that that's how it's done. But even back in Silence, he talks about how the most primary association for his composition were Roland Jeffries, is that the name of the sculptor, and the glass houses of Niels van der Rohe, and this idea that the contemporary art at the time was art that you saw through, and that when you looked at a wire sculpture, the world behind it that you saw through was as much a part of the experience of the sculpture itself. So it was no longer a figure of David, it was the sculpture itself, which included the world that he perceived through it. And I think that's what was going on with the compositions as well. These things interact. That's my shortest take
Thanks,
on
now,
it.
now it's clear.
Yeah, exactly.
Any questions? Okay, thank you, Mark.
Well, thank you so much for the time. I really appreciate it.